First, let's find out how much you know about immigration in the US today. So we're going to have some polls up on your screen. And first poll is, what percentage of the US population is foreign born? Is it 13.7%, 23.7%, 33.7%, or 53.7%? Vote now. So we see that most of you have selected 23.7%. Some of you thought it was 33.7%. Very few of you thought it was 13.7%. That's just about 8% of you all. That is actually the foreign-born share of the US population. It's only 13.7% as of right now. That is not the highest it's ever been either. So pretty surprising statistic there. How about this question? What is the most common country of origin for new immigrants to the United States today? The most common country of origin for new immigrants to the US today. Do you think it's China, India, Mexico, or Haiti? Vote now. Well, this is interesting. So most of you think it's India, followed by China and Mexico. That is actually correct. There are more immigrants coming from India today to the US than coming from Mexico. And finally, views on immigration. These things tend to fluctuate a lot over time, but in this moment, according to Gallup, last year, what percentage of Americans believed that immigration was a good thing for the United States? Do you think it was 23% of Americans thinking that immigration was good, 45%, 62%, or 75%? Vote now. So this is going to be another surprising fact for you. Whereas about 37%, the majority of you said 45% or 23%. Actually, according to Gallup, and we're going to investigate this a little bit further in our first segment, our first module, 75% of Americans overall thought that immigration was good for the US. Now, this is a very, very nuanced topic. So you ask a question in a particular way or in a particular context, and you may get a very different response. Americans have very, very conflicting views about immigration. They may think on the one hand that this is a land of immigrants, but also that we need to restrict immigration, or that we need increased vetting. Many other different things come into play. So it's extremely, extremely complex. So let's go ahead and find out what is the latest data. So more than a century ago, this is what immigration in the US looked like. The majority of immigrants came from Western Europe, from Canada, even from Russia. Very few came from Latin America. You see just a few dots at on the southern border, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. So this was in 1880. By 1900, we see swelling populations of Western and Eastern Europeans, even Canadians up in the north there. 1920, you start seeing more Latin Americans in the south, and that starts to build up, and especially in places like Florida and California. This is 1970, around the time that the immigration law was passed. By 1980, we see vastly shrinking populations of Canadians and Europeans overall, and increasing populations of Asians and especially Latin Americans in the US. This is 1990, and this is 2000. So the face of immigration has changed tremendously over the past century, and unfortunately it's led to this. A lot of people who are leading a backlash against immigration to the US, and it's partly because of things like this. some of the fastest growing states for immigrants are not the traditional gateways of, let's say, California and New York and Texas, but the Dakotas, for instance. Look at the Nevada, other areas that you would not typically think that immigrants would be flocking to. Even places like West Virginia are experiencing vast increases, even though the populations are small, of foreign-born people. But the fact is, we only have about 13.7% of the US population being foreign-born. That's not the highest it's ever been. It's been up to 15%. But of course, the messages that we receive make us think as though it's so much more. Refugee admissions to the US have plummeted to historic lows. We've not seen this in our history. The ceiling that Congress and the President put for refugee admissions is not even being met. We're receiving far fewer refugees than ever before, despite the fact that there are about 70 million displaced people in the world right now. Even the undocumented population is decreasing. If you see it, they peaked in 2005, and it's been gradually going down since then. Even before the Trump presidency, this has been a trend. Regardless of that fact, we have a huge increase in Border Patrol at the southern border. That has skyrocketed despite the fact that apprehensions have gone way, way down, even under this current administration. The fact is, study after study over decades have shown that immigrants are less prone to crime. And think about that. Why would that be? People who move to another country, especially those who move willingly, want to make better lives for themselves. They want to make sure that they stay on the straight and narrow. They want to set a good example for their children. They want to be able to stay. The fact that you can be deported for committing a crime as an immigrant is very much in the minds of many people who are foreign-born. So the idea that immigrants commit more crimes is a huge fallacy. English proficiency has sort of been pretty level over the past few decades. About 52% are fluent in English, and that's a slight uptick over the past few years. And we see that today's immigrants, compared to immigrants from, let's say, 10 years ago, are more likely to be proficient in English than not. In terms of education, the United States is receiving the most educated immigrants it has ever received in its history. More immigrants are coming today with bachelor's and postgraduate degrees than ever before. When you compare it to 1960, where 75% of immigrants who were coming here had less than a high school education, that figure is now 29%. So we're seeing a certain improvement in the education level of immigrants who are coming to the US. And we must bear in mind, especially as educators, that first generation compared to second generation immigrants, there tend to be this vast difference, especially when you look at countries like Mexico and places in Central America. The difference between first generation and second generation in terms of educational attainment can be very, very vast. But that means that a generation in, these immigrants or children of immigrants do far better than their parents did. And that is something that's very, very hopeful. The fact is that the majority of children who live in immigrant households are US citizens. This is projected to increase, of course, and that share of students who are in our school system is going to increase as well. The fact is that many, many cities across the country, from coast to coast, would have experienced tremendous decline in population and economic activity were it not for immigrants. So we're not just thinking of places like New York City and San Francisco, but also in the Midwest, places like Kansas City and Minneapolis and St. Paul, even in the South, places like Atlanta. These places were able to rebound after the 60s and 70s and 80s through immigrant population growth. And we see this especially in our industries. Immigrants are scattered across the spectrum of industries, but they tend to be concentrated in the high and low skilled skills spectrums, high and low skill ends of the skill spectrum. So you see them in computer and math, you see them in architecture and engineering, and then you also see them in farming and fishing and forestry, personal care. Healthcare is certainly an area where immigrants have had a tremendous impact. And think about who's taking care of the baby boomers. It's very likely that they are going to have a foreign-born home health aide, or nurse, or pharmacist, or doctor. When compared to the US population, how come do immigrants have such an outsized role in our labor force? It's because the majority of them come here when they're in the working age category. So compared to the US population, which is certainly aging, you see that massive belly in the middle of the foreign-born pyramid, where most people are coming in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. They come with the intention of working, intention of making a better life for themselves that they would have, compared to what they would have had in their home countries. And without immigration, our labor force will decline. This is simply a fact. Our population is aging, and we need more workers. And again, thinking of baby boomers, who's paying into Social Security? Many of those workers are immigrants, and without them, we will have that shrinking labor force where we would not be able to support Social Security and other social safety systems, things like Medicare. Immigrants, of course, pay taxes. They have a higher propensity to pay taxes than the US-born, and even undocumented immigrants, various studies have shown that up to 75% of them do pay taxes. How do they pay taxes? They use something called an ITIN, an individual tax identification number. And that allows them, that's a legitimate way for the government and the IRS to solicit taxes from undocumented workers. We actually have this built into our system. And the fact is that immigrants, Theo Rigby mentioned it yesterday, are entrepreneurial. And think about it. The act of migrating is in of itself an entrepreneurial act. You leave everything behind, you take a risk, and you move to another country hoping for the best. That entrepreneurial spirit has translated throughout our history, not just recently, from the very start of our country, into immigrants starting businesses. So whereas they're 14% of the population, they are 19% of business owners overall, and 30% of Main Street businesses. Those are mom and pop shops, grocery stores, restaurants, that kind of thing. And we see it all over our country: Chinese restaurants, grocery stores. This is a Swiss bakery, Swiss Bakers here in Boston. And many of the things that we take for granted as American businesses were started by immigrants. Think of the Levi's jeans that you wear. Where did you buy that? In TJ Maxx or Kohl's, founded by immigrants. Nordstrom, things we can't live without today, like Google and Yahoo, Comcast. All of these things are founded by immigrants. And the fact is the American population knows very, very little about immigration. Most Americans incorrectly think that, many Americans incorrectly think that most immigrants here are here illegally. That is incorrect. The majority of immigrants, 75% of them, are here with perfect authorization. Yet still, with all that misinformation, it is on the forefront of many people's minds. They are thinking about immigration when they go to the polls. So in 2016, that was paramount in the minds of people who voted for the current president. And even last year, where healthcare became a huge issue, immigration was still the second most important issue for people who went to the midterm polls last year. And I just want to show one last thing, which is a study that was done, a survey that was done very recently in the US, looking at the hidden tribes of America and what they felt about certain issues, including immigration. It found that, people are scattered across the spectrum, from progressive activists all the way up to devoted conservatives. And of course, we have this politically disengaged group in the middle. However, what it found was that anti-immigrant sentiment in the US is far more passionate than pro-immigrant sentiment in the US. The people who feel strongly about immigration are far more likely to be anti-immigrant than pro-immigrant. The wings, the people who are on either of the extremes, left or right, those wings are increasing in size. So it's not as though there are more people in the middle who are increasing, it's the people on the extremes. And that middle of politically disengaged people tend to veer to the right on social issues. As a result, for change to take place, we need to connect with working class Americans. We need to connect with those people who are politically disengaged. We need to build a broad local support base for sensible immigration policies at the local level. And we need to connect people through values,